What if the oldest words ever carved into clay were never meant to tell us how civilization began? What if they were written by people who knew their world was ending and wanted someone, anyone, in the distant future to know what they had lost? In the deserts of southern Iraq, where the afternoon heat turns the air into ripples of liquid gold, fragments of clay wait beneath the sand. Some are no larger than your hand, others are shattered into pieces so small they could slip between your fingers. Each one carries marks, tiny wedge-shaped impressions pressed deep into the surface by hands that understood something we have forgotten. These marks were not made slowly. They were not made casually. They were pressed into wet clay with the kind of urgency that comes from knowing time is running out. The tablets do not celebrate. They do not boast. They do not describe grand beginnings or glorious foundings. They describe something else entirely. They describe what was, what existed before. What was lost when the waters came and the old world drowned, and the survivors had to begin again with nothing but fragments of memory and the desperate hope that someone would write it all down before the knowledge disappeared forever. These are not the words of pioneers. These are the words of refugees, the last voices of a civilization that knew it was dying, and they were writing for us. Before we go further, before we step into the ruins and the silence and the weight of 5,000 years, take a moment. If mysteries like this pull at something deep inside you, if you have ever wondered what we have forgotten, subscribe to this channel. This is a place for people who are willing to sit with questions that have no easy answers. People who do not mind drifting towards sleep while wondering. And if you are still here right now, wherever you are in the world, leave a comment. Tell me your city. Tell me what hour it is where you are listening. I want to imagine this story spreading across the night, whispered softly into different time zones, carried forward the same way these ancient words were carried forward, by people who believed the message was too important to let die. Now, let us go back to the moment when the world realized these tablets were not what we thought they were. The year is 1872. London, the British Museum, a cramped basement workroom lit by gas lamps. A man named George Smith sits at a wooden table covered in clay fragments. He is young, intense, obsessed. He has taught himself to read cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into these ancient tablets, by spending every spare moment studying them during his lunch breaks. Smith is not a professor. He is not a trained scholar. He is an assistant, a cataloger, someone paid to organize the dusty fragments that no one else wants to look at. But Smith sees something others miss. He sees patterns, repetitions, phrases that appear again and again across tablets from different cities, different time periods, different contexts. And one afternoon, Smith picks up a fragment. He begins to read, and he stops breathing. The tablet describes a flood, not a seasonal overflow, not a bad storm, a flood that covered the earth, a flood that destroyed everything. A man warned by the gods to build a boat, animals brought aboard, waters rising, the world ending, a few survivors, everything lost. Smith recognizes the story instantly. It is nearly identical to the biblical account of Noah, but this version is older, much older, written in cuneiform on clay that dates back thousands of years before the Hebrew scriptures were compiled. Smith is so overwhelmed, so shocked by what he is reading, that his colleagues later report he began tearing off his coat right there in the museum workroom. They thought he had lost his mind. But Smith understood something that would take the world years to accept. This was not mythology. This was documentation. This was a record of something that actually happened. Something so catastrophic, so world-ending, that every culture who survived it wrote the story down and refused to let it be forgotten. But here is what makes these tablets strange. What made Smith stop? What makes scholars uncomfortable even today? They do not read like stories. They read like reports, emergency transmissions, final records pressed into clay by people who knew they were running out of time. People who were not trying to invent myths or create legends. People who were trying to preserve what they could before everything was lost. The tablets describe a world before. cities that existed before the flood, knowledge that was known before the catastrophe, kings who ruled before the waters came, and then they described the moment everything ended, the dividing line, the event that separated the old world from the new, after the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, not for the first time, again. That word haunts every translation, again, as if this had happened before, as if the scribes writing these words knew they were not the first, as if they understood that civilizations rise and fall and rise again, and the only thing that survives is what gets written down, what gets pressed into clay hard enough that fire cannot burn it and water cannot wash it away, and 5,000 years of wind and war and forgetting cannot erase it completely. These scribes were not celebrating the dawn of civilization. They were documenting its twilight. They were writing down everything they could remember about the world that came before. The world their grandparents had told them about. The world that drowned. The world that ended. And they were writing it for us. For whoever came after. For whoever would dig through the ruins and find these fragments and learn to read them and finally understand. This is not the beginning. This is the ending. The record of what was lost. The warning of what happens when civilizations forget. When knowledge is not preserved. When memory is not passed forward. What if every word pressed into these clay tablets is a message from people who watched their world die? What if they were not trying to tell us where we came from, but trying to warn us where we are going? What if we are reading the last words of a world that ended 5,000 years ago? And what if those last words are trying to tell us something about our own? The tablets are still here, scattered across museums, buried beneath the sand, waiting to be read, waiting to be understood, waiting for someone to finally hear what they have been trying to say across the vast silence of time. They were not recording a beginning, they were recording an end. And they hoped, desperately, that whoever found them would learn from it, would remember, would not make the same mistakes. The question is, are we listening? The discovery of these tablets did not happen with fanfare. It happened with dust and confusion and the slow, creeping realization that something was very wrong with the story we had been telling ourselves about human history. Let us begin not with answers, but with the places. The cities that should not exist, the ruins that appeared too suddenly, the evidence that kept whispering the same uncomfortable truth. This was not a beginning, this was an aftermath. Southern Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Today it is mostly desert, flat, empty, brutally hot. In summer, temperatures climb past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun beats down on cracked earth and scattered ruins. The wind carries sand that was once brick, dust that was once temples, particles that were once the homes and markets and libraries of people who lived 5,000 years ago. But when European explorers first arrived in the 1800s, they saw something strange. Rising from the flat desert floor were mounds, enormous artificial hills of compacted earth and crumbled brick. Some were as tall as small mountains. The locals called them tells. They knew these mounds were not natural. They knew something was buried inside them, but they did not know what. The explorers came looking for treasure, for gold and statues, and proof that the biblical cities mentioned in Scripture had actually existed. They came with shovels and hired workers and very little patience. They were not archaeologists in any modern sense. They were treasure hunters, and what they found was not what they expected. They found clay, mountains of it, rooms filled with it, tablets stacked on shelves that had rotted away centuries ago, fragments scattered across floors, pieces that had been buried under collapsed ceilings when palaces burned and cities fell and empires crumbled into dust. Austin Henry Layard was one of the first. Born in 1817, restless and ambitious, Layard traveled to Mesopotamia in his 20s, searching for adventure and ancient glory. In 1845, he began digging at a mound called Nimrud in northern Iraq. Beneath the dirt, his workers found an Assyrian palace. Massive stone sculptures of winged bulls with human heads, walls covered in carved reliefs showing kings and battles and hunts. It was spectacular. It made Layard famous across Europe. But it was not enough. Layard wanted more. He wanted to find Nineveh, the great capital mentioned in the Bible, the city that had been destroyed and lost for over 2,000 years. In 1849, he turned his attention to a mound near Mosul called Kuyunjik, and there, beneath centuries of accumulated debris, his workers broke through into something unexpected. Not treasure rooms, not throne rooms filled with gold, but archive rooms, storage chambers, libraries. The floors were covered with clay tablets, thousands of them, some whole, most broken, all covered in the same wedge-shaped marks that no one could yet read. Layard did not understand what he had found. He could see the tablets were old, he could see they were deliberately stored, organized, catalogued, but he could not read them. No one in the modern world could. The script had been dead for nearly 2,000 years. The language beneath the script had been dead even longer. But Layard was smart enough to know these tablets mattered. He packed them carefully into wooden crates. He shipped them back to London, to the British Museum, where they would sit in dark storage rooms for years, waiting for someone to unlock the code, waiting for someone to hear what they were trying to say. Layard was not alone. Other excavators were working at other sites, finding the same thing. Tablets, everywhere. Thousands upon thousands of them, tens of thousands. More than could be counted, or catalogued, or understood. Hormuzd Rassam, an Assyrian Christian from Mosul who had worked as Layard's assistant, took over the excavations at Nineveh. He found more tablet rooms, more archives, more libraries filled with clay fragments, religious texts, medical prescriptions, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, letters between kings, legal contracts, school exercises where students had practiced writing the same phrases over and over until they got it right. Further south, French archaeologists, led by Ernest de Sarzec, began digging at a site called Tello, the ruins of the ancient Sumerian city of Lagash. They found temples, statues, and more tablets. These were older than the Assyrian ones from Nineveh. They were written in a different language, Sumerian, a language so old and so strange that it had no known relatives anywhere in the world. A language that appeared fully formed and then disappeared, leaving only these clay fragments as evidence it had ever existed. At Nippur, located between the two great rivers, American archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania began excavating in 1889. The conditions were brutal. Heat, disease, sandstorms. Several team members died. But they kept digging because what they were finding was worth the cost. Nippur had been a religious and educational center in ancient Sumer, a place where scribes were trained, where knowledge was preserved, where the sacred texts were copied and recopied across generations. The excavators found school buildings, tablet houses, training centers where young scribes had learned their craft. The floors were covered with student exercises, boys copying multiplication tables, practicing grammar, writing out hymns and proverbs over and over, learning how to press a reed stylus into wet clay with just the right angle and pressure to create clean, readable wedge marks that would still be legible 5,000 years later. And then there was Ur. The city of Ur sat in the far south, near where the Euphrates River once emptied into the Persian Gulf. Today, the site is inland, miles from the coast, because millennia of silt deposition have pushed the shoreline further out. But in ancient times, Ur was a port, a center of trade, a wealthy, powerful city. Leonard Woolley began excavating Ur in 1922. Unlike the earlier treasure hunters, Woolley was a trained archaeologist. He understood that context mattered, that where something was found and how it was buried could tell you as much as the object itself. He dug slowly, carefully, recording everything, drawing maps, taking photographs, preserving not just artifacts but information. Woolley's team uncovered the Royal Cemetery of Ur, a complex of elaborate tombs dating to around 2,600 before the Common Era. Inside were treasures that stunned the world. Gold jewelry, headdresses made of lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, musical instruments decorated with precious materials, and evidence of human sacrifice. Dozens of attendants buried alongside their rulers, apparently poisoned, laid out in neat rows, still wearing their finest clothes and jewelry. But the royal cemetery was not what changed everything. The discovery that mattered came later, deeper. When Woolley's workers were digging a test trench trying to reach the earliest levels of the city, the trench went down through layers of pottery and tools and building debris, through occupation levels showing people living, working, building. Then it hit something strange: clean clay, sterile sediment, no artifacts, no charcoal, no pottery fragments, no trace of human activity, just pure water-deposited silt. Woolley told his workers to keep digging. They went down through that sterile layer, 1 meter, 2 meters, nearly 8 feet of flood sediment. And then, beneath that barrier of mud, the artifacts started again. Pottery, but different pottery. Older styles, different shapes, different decoration, different clay. Woolley stood at the bottom of that trench and understood. He was looking at 2 civilizations, one buried beneath the flood, one built on top after the waters receded. The clay layer was not just geology, it was history. It was the physical evidence of the moment everything ended. The dividing line between the world that was and the world that came after. He ordered more trenches dug in different parts of the site. Same result. The flood layer appeared everywhere, separating the old city from the new, separating the before from the after. When Woolley published his findings, newspapers around the world ran headlines declaring he had found proof of the biblical flood, proof that Noah's story was real, proof that God had judged humanity exactly as Genesis described. Woolley himself was more careful. He knew the flood had not been global. The layer did not appear at sites in the mountains or on higher ground, only in the low-lying river valleys. But within the world the ancient Mesopotamians inhabited, within the geography they knew, the flood had been total. Every city, every field, every village, gone, covered, destroyed. And other archaeologists were finding the same thing. At Shuruppak, a city mentioned in Sumerian legends as the home of the flood hero, excavators found a thick layer of water-deposited silt. At Kish, at Eridu, at multiple sites across southern Mesopotamia, the pattern repeated. Occupation, flood, occupation. The same sequence, the same story written in geology. But here is what made the discovery truly unsettling: the timing. When the flood layers were dated using pottery styles and stratigraphic correlation, they all fell around the same period, roughly 2,900 before the Common Era, not vaguely ancient, not mythological time. A specific moment in history that could be dated and measured and confirmed, and that date matched exactly what the tablets described. The tablets that were being translated in museums thousands of miles away. The tablets that told stories of a great flood that divided history into before and after. The tablets that listed kings who ruled before the waters came and different kings who ruled after kingship was lowered from heaven again. The physical evidence and the written testimony were telling the same story. Something catastrophic had happened. Something that destroyed the existing world. Something that forced survivors to rebuild from fragments. Something that was remembered so clearly, so traumatically, that people wrote it down and copied it and preserved it across thousands of years because they knew it was too important to forget. Back in London, George Smith was not the only scholar working on the tablets. By the 1,870 seconds and 1,880 seconds, cuneiform had been deciphered. The breakthrough came when researchers realized that many royal inscriptions were written in multiple languages: Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian. By using the known Persian as a key, they could decode the others. It was slow work, painstaking, but gradually the ancient languages began to give up their secrets. And what those secrets revealed was deeply strange. The tablets did not describe primitive people stumbling toward civilization. They described sophisticated cultures with complex knowledge, advanced systems, and an overwhelming sense that they were preserving something rather than creating it. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the tablet that had shocked George Smith, was just one text among thousands. As more tablets were translated, more flood stories emerged. The Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, the Sumerian king list, different versions, different details, but the same core narrative. There was a world before. It was destroyed by water. A few survived. They rebuilt. And they wrote everything down so the knowledge would not be lost again. But these were not just flood stories. Mixed in with the narratives were practical texts, instructions, information, knowledge that seemed far too advanced for the time periods involved. Mathematical tables using a base 60 system that we still use today, astronomical observations tracking Venus with precision not matched again until telescopes were invented, medical prescriptions using plants that actually contain effective medicinal compounds, legal codes as sophisticated as modern jurisprudence, architectural knowledge demonstrating understanding of engineering principles, all of it appearing complete, all of it present from the earliest layers. No slow development, no gradual refinement, just sudden sophistication, as if someone had taken a fully functioning civilization and pressed it into clay all at once. The archaeologists began asking uncomfortable questions. Where did this knowledge come from? How did the Sumerians develop writing so quickly? Why did their cities appear with urban planning already in place? Why did their mathematics work perfectly from the start? Why did their astronomy require institutional observations spanning generations? And the tablets had an answer that appeared again and again in different texts, an answer that scholars wanted to dismiss as mythology, but could not quite explain away. The knowledge was given, not invented, not developed through trial and error, given, taught, transmitted from those who knew to those who did not. The tablets describe divine teachers, beings called the Anunnaki, who descended from elsewhere and taught humanity the arts of civilization, how to write, how to calculate, how to observe the stars, how to build cities, how to organize societies, how to preserve knowledge across generations. Modern scholars assumed this was allegory, primitive people crediting gods for achievements that were actually human. But what if the tablets meant exactly what they said? Not that supernatural beings taught humanity, but that someone taught them. Survivors of the world that came before. Refugees carrying fragments of knowledge from a civilization that had been destroyed. Teachers who were remembered as gods simply because their knowledge seemed impossibly advanced compared to what came after the catastrophe. What if the Sumerians were not lying? What if they were not exaggerating? What if they were simply documenting what they knew to be true? That their civilization was not a beginning but a continuation, not an invention but a restoration, not creation but recovery. The excavators kept digging, the translators kept reading, and the evidence kept accumulating. Evidence that these tablets were not myths or legends or religious fantasies. Evidence that they were records. Documentation. The final testimony of a world that knew it was ending and desperately tried to pass something forward before everything was lost. The cities buried beneath the sand were not the first cities. They were the cities that came after. Built on top of older cities. Built by people who remembered that there had been something before. Something greater. Something that drowned. And those people wrote it all down. They pressed words into wet clay with urgent hands. They fired the tablets to make them permanent. They stored them in archives and libraries. They copied old texts to preserve them. They trained students to maintain the knowledge. They did everything they could to make sure that if catastrophe came again, something would survive. Some record would remain. Some voice would still be speaking, even after everyone who remembered was gone. The discovery was not just archaeological, it was existential. These tablets were not describing the dawn of human civilization. They were describing its dusk, The long twilight, after the sun had already set on something older and greater and now lost, and they were writing for us. For whoever came after, for whoever would stand in the ruins thousands of years later and ask the question that echoes across time. What happened? What was lost? And how do we make sure it does not happen again? The tablets do not speak of dawn. They speak of dusk. When you read them carefully, when you strip away the assumptions we bring to ancient texts, when you listen to what they are actually saying rather than what we want them to say, a pattern emerges. These are not creation stories. These are ending stories. Records of what existed before the world changed. Testimony from people who knew they were living in the aftermath of something catastrophic. Let us start with the simplest texts. The administrative documents. The ones that seem boring at first glance. Lists of supplies, inventories, receipts, the everyday paperwork of a functioning civilization. A tablet from Uruk, dated to around 3200 before the Common Era, lists barley rations distributed to temple workers. So many measures to the brewers, so many to the bakers, so many to the shepherds. The amounts are precise, the calculations are correct. The handwriting is professional. This is one of the oldest examples of writing we have. And it is not someone learning how to write. It is not experimental. It is not tentative. It is expert record keeping. The kind that requires training. The kind that requires institutional knowledge. The kind that requires a system already in place. But where did that system come from? Writing does not appear overnight. Languages do not invent themselves. Bureaucracies do not organize spontaneously. These things take time to develop. Generations, centuries, trial and error, refinement, evolution. Yet Sumerian writing appears complete. Over 700 symbols in use from the beginning. A hybrid system combining word signs and sound signs. The sophistication you would expect after centuries of development, but with no evidence of those developmental centuries. Just the finished product, as if someone took an existing system and transplanted it fully formed. The same pattern appears in the content. A tablet from Nippur contains a problem asking scribes to calculate how much earth must be moved to dig a canal of specific dimensions. This requires understanding volume, multiplication, division, unit conversion. The student who solved this problem got the answer right. Using base 60 mathematics from the earliest period, another tablet lists the recipe for bronze. Copper and tin in the correct ratio. 88% copper, 12% tin. The optimal mixture. Too much tin makes the metal brittle, too little makes it soft. The Sumerians knew the exact proportions from the start. No tablets show them experimenting. No evidence of trial batches that failed. Just correct metallurgy appearing suddenly. Medical texts are even stranger. A collection from Nippur describes treatments for dozens of conditions. Infections, digestive problems, wounds, fevers. The prescriptions use specific plants. Thyme for respiratory illness. Willow bark for pain. Fermented grains for stomach ailments. Honey for wound care. Modern pharmacologists have analyzed these remedies. They work. The plants contain compounds with genuine medical effects. The Sumerians were not guessing. They were not relying on magic. They were using treatments that had been tested and proven effective over long periods of careful observation. But how did they know? Medical knowledge requires generations of experimentation. You try different plants, different preparations, different doses. You see what helps and what harms. You build understanding slowly through accumulated experience. This process takes time, lifetimes, centuries. Yet Sumerian medicine appears effective immediately. No primitive stages, no records of failed treatments, no evidence of learning through mistakes, just functional pharmacology from the earliest texts. Move to astronomy. The tablets contain detailed observations of Venus, when it appears in the morning sky, when it disappears, when it reappears in the evening. The observations are accurate to within 1 day over a 21-year cycle. Venus does not make this easy. Its patterns are complex. The cycles take years to recognize. To create records this accurate requires watching the sky every night for decades, recording positions, noting patterns, comparing observations across generations. This demands institutional commitment, multiple astronomers working together over long periods, all following the same methods, all contributing to collective knowledge. The Sumerians had this. From the beginning, the earliest astronomical texts show the same sophistication as later ones. No learning phase, no errors being corrected, just precision from the start. They tracked lunar eclipses. They recognized the Saros cycle, the 18-year period when eclipse patterns repeat. Knowing this allows prediction. The moon will be eclipsed on this date, the sun on that date. But recognizing the Saros cycle requires observing multiple cycles, 3 or 4 complete repetitions to be certain. That is 70 years of continuous sky watching, 3 generations of astronomers, all keeping records, all building on what came before. How did they do this unless someone taught them, unless someone showed them what to look for, unless someone passed down observational knowledge that predated the Sumerian civilization itself? The architectural knowledge tells the same story. The ziggurat at Ur is a massive structure. Millions of mud bricks, aligned to cardinal directions with less than 1 degree of error. This requires sophisticated surveying, understanding of geometry, knowledge of how to calculate angles and measure distances precisely. Building something this large requires understanding engineering, how to distribute weight, how to prevent sinking into soft soil, how to ensure stability over centuries. This knowledge normally comes from experience, from building smaller structures first, from learning what works through failures and corrections. But Sumerian architecture shows competence immediately. The early ziggurats are well engineered. They stand for thousands of years. There are no collapsed proto-ziggurats showing them learning through mistakes, just skill from the first attempts. Legal texts demonstrate the same pattern. The earliest Sumerian law codes are complex. They distinguish between intentional and accidental harm. They recognize different social classes with different rights. They include provisions for property, contracts, marriage, divorce, inheritance, and commerce. They specify punishments proportional to crimes. They include appeals processes. This is sophisticated jurisprudence, the kind that usually evolves over centuries as societies encounter new problems and develop solutions. But Sumerian law appears comprehensive from the beginning, as if the legal framework was designed all at once by people who already understood the full range of human conflict and how to resolve it. And woven through all of these texts, through the mathematics and medicine and astronomy and architecture and law, is a phrase that appears again and again, a phrase that should make us pause, a phrase that the tablets repeat in different contexts across different time periods. From distant days. Not we invented this, not we discovered this. From distant days. As if the knowledge came from before, from a time beyond their own memory, from people who came earlier, from the world that existed before the one they were living in. One hymn from Eridu describes the god Enki organizing the world after the flood. He goes to each city, he assigns its function. He teaches the people what they need to know, how to dig canals, how to plant crops, how to build temples, how to maintain the sacred knowledge. This is not poetic metaphor, the text is specific. Enki taught, past tense, instruction already given, knowledge already transmitted. The hymn describes Enki as organizing what was left, restoring what could be saved, not creating something new but rebuilding something old. Another text describes the goddess Inanna receiving the divine decrees, the tablets of destiny, the me. These are not abstract concepts, they are described as physical objects, portable, containing knowledge. Inanna brings them from one city to another. The knowledge is not generated locally. It is brought from elsewhere, transferred, transmitted. The Sumerian king list opens with a phrase that has puzzled scholars for over a century. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, descended, not emerged, not developed, not arose, descended, from somewhere else, from above, from outside. As if the organizational structure of civilization came from beyond the people who were using it, the text then lists kings who ruled before the flood. Alulim, who reigned 28,800 years. Al-Algar, who reigned 36,000 years. These numbers cannot be literal human lifespans, but they are not random. They are all multiples of 3,600. The Sumerian Sa, a standard unit for measuring long periods. What if these numbers are not biographical? What if they represent something else? Time periods, observational cycles, ages, epochs, spans of astronomical or geological significance, measured in Sa units. If that is true, then the king list is not mythology, it is chronology. A calendar system, a way of marking vast stretches of time during which something was observed, recorded, maintained. Knowledge accumulated across periods far longer than individual human lives. And then the list reaches the dividing line. The moment everything changed, the flood swept over. When kingship was lowered from heaven again. That word, appearing in translation after translation, lowered from heaven again, not for the first time, again. As if this had happened before. As if the organizational structure of civilization had existed, been destroyed, and then been restored. As if the people writing this understood that what they were building was not new, it was recovery, reconstruction, restoration. Other tablets describe the pre-flood world in more detail. The Eridu Genesis mentions 5 cities that existed before the waters came. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. Each one with temples, each one with rulers, each one functioning as a center of civilization before the catastrophe. The text does not spend time describing how these cities were founded. It assumes they already existed. It focuses instead on what happened to them. How the gods decided to send a flood. How one god, Enki, warned a man named Ziusudra. How Ziusudra built a boat. How he survived. How he made offerings after the waters receded. How the gods granted him eternal life for preserving humanity. The story is practical, matter of fact, no extended drama, no elaborate theology, just a record of events. There were cities, there was a flood, one man survived, life continued. But embedded in that simple narrative is an important detail. Ziusudra was king of Shuruppak. Shuruppak was a real city. Archaeologists excavated it, and at Shuruppak they found the flood layer, 2 meters of sterile silt separating older occupation from newer. The physical evidence matches the story. The geology confirms the text. The Atrahasis epic provides even more detail. It describes the world before the flood as crowded, full of people. Humanity had multiplied and spread across the land. The noise of their activities rose to heaven and disturbed the gods. This suggests large populations, dense settlements. Civilization developed enough to be loud, to have impact, to be noticed. Then the flood, then destruction, then silence, then the slow work of rebuilding. But before the flood comes, the text describes something crucial. Enki warns Atrahasis to build a boat. He gives specific dimensions, specific instructions, and he tells Atrahasis to bring craftsmen, not just family, not just animals, but people with skills, people who know how to make things, people whose knowledge will be necessary after the catastrophe. This detail is revealing. Atrahasis does not just save genetic diversity, he saves cultural knowledge. He brings the people who can rebuild, the metalworkers, the potters, the scribes, the people who carry civilization in their hands and minds and memories. This is emergency protocol, survival planning, knowledge preservation. This is what you do when you know disaster is coming and you want something to survive beyond it. You identify what is essential. You gather it. You protect it. You carry it forward. The tablets are describing exactly this, a deliberate, organized effort to preserve knowledge across a catastrophe, to make sure that after the waters recede, after the destruction ends, after the survivors emerge from wherever they sheltered, there will be people who remember, people who know how things work, people who can teach, people who can pass it on. And the Sumerians were those people. Or rather, they were the inheritors of those people, the students of the survivors, the ones who learned from refugees who carried fragments of an older world, the ones who wrote it all down because they understood how easily knowledge can be lost, how quickly memory fades, how catastrophe can erase centuries of accumulated understanding in a single generation. That is why the tablets read the way they do, not as proud declarations of human achievement, but as desperate preservation efforts. Emergency records, final testimony, the last words of people who knew what had been lost and were trying to save what remained. The phrase appears over and over in different forms. Restoration of what was before, the divine decrees from ancient times, the foundations laid in distant days, the knowledge given by those who came from elsewhere, the teachers who descended and showed humanity how to rebuild. These are not creation myths. These are recovery stories, accounts of how civilization was restored after it collapsed, how knowledge was transmitted from those who survived to those who came after, how the world that exists now was built on the ruins of something older. The tablets are not describing our beginning. They are describing our second chance, our inheritance from people who lived through the ending and made sure something would survive. And they wrote it in clay, because clay does not burn. Clay does not rot. Clay lasts. Even when everything else is destroyed, clay remains. Hard, silent, holding words pressed by hands that knew time was running out. The tablets are still speaking, still trying to tell us what happened, still trying to pass forward the warning that was passed to them, still trying to make sure we remember what they remembered. That civilization's end, that knowledge can be lost, that catastrophe comes, and that the only defense is memory and preservation. The deliberate, determined effort to write it down before it is too late. They wrote, they survived in clay, and now we hold their words. The last testimony from a world that ended. The warning from people who lived through collapse and wanted us to know. This has happened before. It can happen again. Remember, preserve, pass it forward. Do not let it be lost. PHASE 4. The catastrophe. They witnessed 3,500 plus words. The earth does not lie. It cannot rewrite its story. It cannot soften the truth or hide what happened. It simply holds the record, layer by layer, year by year, century by century. And when we dig down through those layers with careful hands and patient tools, we find evidence that cannot be denied. Water, the memory of water, the proof that something catastrophic happened exactly when the tablets say it did. Let us return to Leonard Woolley standing at the bottom of his excavation trench at Ur in the winter of 1929. His workers have been digging for weeks, going down through pottery and tools and the ordinary debris of ancient life, layer after layer of human occupation, evidence of people living, working, building. Then suddenly the artifacts stop, clean clay, sterile sediment, nothing. Woolley assumes this is the bottom, the natural ground beneath the city, the end of human history at this site. He is about to move on, but something makes him hesitate. Maybe instinct, maybe thoroughness, maybe just curiosity. He orders his workers to keep digging, to go deeper, to see what lies below the clay. They dig, 1 meter down through sterile silt, then 2 meters, nearly 8 feet of pure flood deposit. No pottery, no tools, no charcoal, no bones, no trace of human presence. Just mud that settled out of water and hardened over time. And then, at the bottom of that 8-foot barrier, the artifacts begin again. Pottery. But different pottery. Older styles, different shapes, different decorations, different firing techniques. The kind of pottery that belongs to a culture that existed before the Sumerians, before the first cities, before written records. Woolley stands there, looking at the walls of his trench, at the sequence written in earth and clay. Civilization, flood, civilization, two worlds separated by water, the sandwich of history, and he understands what he is seeing. This is not seasonal flooding. This is not a river overflowing its banks during spring melt. This is catastrophe. This is the kind of flood that covers everything, that buries entire cities, that forces people to flee or die, that divides time into before and after. 8 feet of silt does not happen overnight, but it does not happen gradually either. That much sediment requires massive amounts of water moving with enormous force, water that stays long enough for all that mud to settle out. Weeks, maybe months. The entire region transformed into a vast, shallow lake. Everything submerged, everything destroyed, and when the waters finally recede, nothing remains but mud and silence, and the memory of what was lost. Woolley orders more test trenches dug in different parts of the site. Same result every time. The flood layer appears everywhere, consistent depth, same characteristics, same sterile clay separating 2 distinct periods of occupation. This is not localized flooding affecting one neighborhood. This is total inundation covering the entire city and everything around it. He publishes his findings carefully. He describes the stratigraphy, the sequence of layers, the pottery evidence showing cultural discontinuity. He offers his interpretation. A major flood struck southern Mesopotamia around 2900 before the Common Era. It destroyed existing settlements. When the waters receded, survivors returned and built new cities on top of the ruins. The newspapers are less careful. They declare Woolley has found Noah's flood, proof that the Bible is literally true, proof that God judged humanity exactly as Genesis describes. The headlines scream around the world. Biblical flood discovered. Science confirms scripture. Faith vindicated. Woolley tries to correct the exaggeration. He explains that the flood was regional, not global, that it affected the river valleys of Mesopotamia but not the mountains of Turkey or the coasts of the Mediterranean, that other parts of the world show no evidence of flooding at this time. But his careful qualifications are buried beneath the sensational headlines. The story is too good. The Bible proven right. People want to believe it. But here is what makes Woolley's discovery truly significant. It is not unique. Other archaeologists at other sites are finding exactly the same thing. The same flood layer, the same sterile silt, the same evidence of catastrophe dividing occupation periods. The pattern repeats across the entire region. At Shuruppak, the ancient city mentioned in Sumerian legends as home to Ziusudra, the flood hero, German excavators find a thick layer of water-deposited clay. No artifacts, no cultural material, just flood sediment separating older settlement from newer. And the dating matches. Same period, same catastrophe, around 2900 before the Common Era. At Kish, north of Babylon, British archaeologist Stephen Langdon finds another flood layer. Same characteristics, same timing. The excavation walls show the sequence clearly. Occupation, flood silt, occupation, the geological evidence of disaster. At Eridu, the southernmost Sumerian city, traditionally considered the oldest settlement in the region, excavators find evidence of multiple flooding episodes. The city was built, abandoned, rebuilt, abandoned again, rebuilt again. Water was a constant threat in these low-lying plains. But one flood stands out. Thicker, more extensive, more devastating than the others. And it dates to the same period as the floods at and Shuruppak and Kish. The evidence accumulates. Site after site, city after city, all showing the same thing. Around 2900 before the Common Era, something catastrophic happened. Water on a scale that disrupted every human settlement along the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. Not a normal seasonal flood. Not a bad storm. Something that covered everything. That destroyed everything. That forced complete abandonment and later reoccupation. But why? What could cause flooding on this scale? The Tigris and Euphrates are major rivers. They carry enormous volumes of water from the mountains of Turkey and Iran down to the Persian Gulf. Every spring when the snow melts, the rivers rise. This is normal, expected. People living in flood-prone areas learn to cope. They build on higher ground. They construct levees. They move their animals and possessions when the waters come. But 8 feet of silt is not normal flooding. That is catastrophic. That requires exceptional circumstances. Several theories have been proposed. One possibility is a combination of factors all occurring at once. Unusually heavy snowfall in the mountains during winter, rapid warming in spring causing sudden snowmelt, heavy rains at the same time, all the water flowing downstream simultaneously, overwhelming the river channels, spilling out across the flat plains. Southern Mesopotamia is almost perfectly flat. The gradient is minimal. Water does not drain quickly. If enough water arrives at once, it spreads out laterally with nowhere to go. The entire landscape becomes a shallow lake. It might take weeks or even months for the water to drain back into the rivers and flow to the Gulf. During that time, anyone living in the lowlands would have to evacuate, climb to whatever high ground exists, wait, hope, and when they finally return, they would find their homes collapsed, their fields buried in mud, their possessions destroyed, everything gone, forced to start over. This scenario is plausible. It fits the evidence. It explains the flood layers using natural processes. No supernatural intervention required. Just hydrology and bad timing, and the terrible vulnerability of people living on flat river plains. But there is another possibility. One that is more controversial but gaining support from an unexpected direction. Cosmology. The study of impacts. The investigation of what happens when objects from space collide with Earth. In the late 20th century, scientists studying ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica discovered something that changed our understanding of Earth's climate history. The planet's climate is not stable. It does not change gradually. It changes abruptly, sometimes catastrophically. And sometimes those changes are triggered by external events. Around 12,800 years ago, the planet was warming, emerging from the last ice age. The massive ice sheets covering North America and northern Europe were melting. Sea levels were rising. And then suddenly, the warming stopped. Temperatures plunged. The ice advanced again. This cold period lasted roughly 1,200 years. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas, named after a small Arctic flower that reappeared in Europe during this time. What caused it? For decades, researchers debated. Some suggested changes in ocean circulation. Others proposed volcanic eruptions. But in the early 2000s, a new theory emerged. Impact. A comet or asteroid breaking apart in Earth's atmosphere. Multiple fragments striking the North American ice sheet. The impacts causing massive melting, triggering wildfires, throwing debris into the atmosphere that blocked sunlight and caused rapid cooling. The evidence for this impact includes unusual materials found in a thin sediment layer dated precisely to the start of the Younger Dryas. Nanodiamonds, tiny crystals formed under extreme pressure and heat. Magnetic spherules, small metallic particles created when rock is vaporized and then condenses. High concentrations of platinum and iridium, elements rare on Earth's surface, but common in asteroids. Carbon spherules, droplets of melted carbon formed during intense fires. This impact theory remains debated. Some scientists accept it. Others argue the evidence is inconclusive or misinterpreted. But what is not debated is that something dramatic happened at the end of the Ice Age. Megafauna went extinct. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats. Entire species disappeared within centuries. Human populations collapsed. The Clovis culture that had spread across North America vanished from the archaeological record, and sea levels rose rapidly. Over 400 feet during the several thousand years following the Younger Dryas, coastlines were redrawn, river valleys were drowned. Any human settlements along those coasts, any villages or camps or fishing communities, were submerged beneath what is now ocean floor. If people were living on those coasts, and there is every reason to think they were, their world disappeared. Everything they knew was drowned. The survivors would have had to move inland, away from the rising water, carrying only what they could save. Stories, skills, fragments of knowledge, memory of the world before the waters came. Those memories would have been passed down through generations. Oral traditions describing the time when the coastline was different, when you could walk to places that are now islands, when land existed where there is now only water. Stories about ancestors who lived in places that no longer exist. By the time writing was invented thousands of years later, those oral traditions would be ancient, distorted by countless retellings, mixed with mythology and theology, but still containing a core of truth, a memory of catastrophe, a memory of loss, a memory of the world transformed by rising water. The Mesopotamian flood myths might preserve that deep ancestral memory. But if the Ice Age flooding happened 12,000 years ago, and the Mesopotamian flood layer dates to only 2,900 before the Common Era, those are not the same event. They are separated by 9,000 years. Unless there were multiple floods, multiple catastrophes. The global event at the end of the Ice Age that raised sea levels worldwide and drowned coastal settlements. And then, much later, a regional flood in Mesopotamia that was devastating enough within its local context to become the defining catastrophe of that culture. Both preserved in the same stories, both remembered as the flood, both conflated over time into a single narrative. This would explain why flood myths appear in cultures around the world. Not because one story spread through trade and cultural contact, but because many different cultures experienced flooding at different times. Coastal populations displaced by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. River valley communities destroyed by regional floods in later periods. Each culture preserving its own memory of disaster, each story adapted to local circumstances and beliefs, but all sharing common elements because they describe similar events. Water, destruction, survival, rebuilding. The geological evidence supports this interpretation. Core samples from the Persian Gulf show rapid sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age. Much of what is now underwater was dry land 12,000 years ago. River valleys, plains, habitable territory. As the ice melted and water rose, that land was inundated. The coastline moved inland. The Gulf expanded to its current size. If people lived in those river valleys before they were drowned, we would never find their settlements using traditional archaeology. The sites are underwater, inaccessible, beyond reach. We can only find their legacy, the knowledge they passed on, the stories they told, the memory preserved by those who survived and moved to higher ground. And that is exactly what the Mesopotamian tablets describe. A world that existed before. Cities along rivers, people living in prosperity. Knowledge accumulated over long periods. Then catastrophe, water covering everything, destruction, survival by a few, and the desperate effort to preserve what could be saved, to write it down, to pass it forward, to make sure the knowledge did not die completely. The tablets are not exaggerating, they are documenting. The flood was real, the geology proves it. The 8 feet of silt at is real. The matching flood layers at Shuruppak and Kish and Eridu are real. The destruction was real. The abandonment was real. The rebuilding was real. And if the physical catastrophe was real, then maybe the rest of the story is real too. Maybe the descriptions of the pre-flood world are not fantasy. Maybe the claims about inherited knowledge are not mythology. Maybe the references to teachers who came from elsewhere are not allegory but history. The history of survivors carrying knowledge from a destroyed civilization to those who would rebuild. The scribes who pressed these words into clay were not making it up. They were recording what they had been told, what their grandparents had told them, What had been passed down through oral tradition until writing was invented, and it could finally be documented permanently. They were preserving memory, the memory of catastrophe, the memory of loss, the memory of the world before the waters came, and they were giving us a warning. A warning written in cuneiform on clay tablets buried for thousands of years. A warning confirmed by 8 feet of flood silt in excavation trenches. A warning that echoes across time from people who lived through the ending and wanted us to know. This has happened before. Water came. Civilizations drowned. Knowledge was lost. Survivors rebuilt from fragments. And it took generations to recover even a portion of what had been destroyed. The tablets are not myths. They are testimony. Eyewitness accounts filtered through generations but still grounded in reality. The reality of catastrophe, the reality of survival, the reality of the long, hard work of rebuilding after everything you knew has been washed away. The earth remembers. The flood layer at Ur is still there. You can visit the site. You can see the trenches. You can touch the sterile clay with your own hands. The evidence is not hidden. It is not controversial in terms of existence. Every archaeologist who has worked in southern Mesopotamia knows about the flood layers. The question is not whether they exist. The question is what they mean. Mainstream archaeology treats them as evidence of local flooding. Severe, but not unprecedented. The kind of thing that happens periodically in river valleys. Tragic for those who lived through it, but not particularly significant for understanding human history. But what if that interpretation misses the point? What if the flood layers mark something more important? Not just a natural disaster, but a rupture. A moment when cultural continuity broke, when the chain of knowledge transmission was severed, when survivors had to piece together civilization from memory and fragments and whatever could be salvaged from the ruins. The tablets say this is exactly what happened. They say the flood divided history. They say kingship descended from heaven again after the waters swept over. They say knowledge had to be restored. They say the world after was built on the ruins of the world before. And 8 feet of sterile clay in the bottom of Woolley's trench says they were telling the truth. The water came. The world ended. And what rose afterward was not a beginning. It was an aftermath, a recovery, a desperate attempt to save what could be saved before memory faded, and knowledge was lost forever. The catastrophe was real. The tablets are not lying. And if they are not lying about the flood, then perhaps we should reconsider everything else they claim. About the world before, about the knowledge that was lost, about the teachers who preserved what they could, about the warning they pressed into clay for us to find 5,000 years later. The warning is simple. Civilizations end, knowledge dies, catastrophe comes without mercy, and the only defense is memory. Preservation, writing it down, passing it forward, making sure that someone, somewhere, will remember what was lost and why it mattered. They wrote. They survived in clay. And now, we hold their warning. The testimony from people who lived through the ending, the proof written in geology and cuneiform, and the desperate urgency of hands pressing words into mud before time ran out. Listen, remember, preserve, because they knew something we are forgetting, that everything can be lost, and that the only thing standing between civilization and oblivion is the choice to write it down, to save it, to pass it forward. The earth remembers, the clay remembers, and now we remember too, if we choose to listen, if we choose to understand, if we choose to heed the warning pressed into clay by people who knew what ending looks like and wanted to make sure we would recognize it if it came for us. The flood was not alone. The ending was not witnessed by one culture in one place. The memory of catastrophe echoes across the entire planet, from cultures separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of miles, from people who never met, who never traded, who never shared a single word. Yet they all tell the same story, not a story of beginnings, a story of endings, of worlds that came before, of catastrophe that destroyed them, of survivors who rebuilt from fragments, of knowledge carried forward by the few who remembered. The details change. The names change. The gods change. But the structure remains identical. Warning, catastrophe, survival, rebuilding, over and over, as if the same event was witnessed from different angles by different peoples, each preserving the memory in their own language, their own mythology, their own way of understanding what had happened. If the Mesopotamian tablets stood alone, we could dismiss them as regional mythology. One culture's attempt to explain seasonal flooding by elevating it into cosmic drama. But the tablets do not stand alone. They are part of a chorus. Voices speaking across continents and centuries, all saying the same thing. The water came, the old world ended. This is what came after. In southeastern Turkey, on a hilltop overlooking the Mesopotamian plains, archaeologists discovered something that should not exist. Göbekli Tepe, a massive stone temple complex dating to 11,600 years ago, built during the Stone Age, before agriculture, before cities, before pottery, before metal, before everything we thought was necessary for monumental architecture. The site consists of enormous stone pillars, arranged in circles. Each pillar weighs up to 20 tons. Each is carved with detailed reliefs of animals: foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, birds. The craftsmanship is sophisticated, professional, the work of people who knew exactly what they were doing, who had done this before, who had traditions and techniques and organized labor. But here is what makes Göbekli Tepe truly strange. It was deliberately buried, not abandoned, not destroyed by enemies or natural disaster, buried, intentionally, carefully. Someone took the time and effort to fill in the entire complex with earth and rubble, to cover it completely, to hide it beneath an artificial hill. Why? Why would you build something this massive, this important, this labor-intensive, and then bury it? Why preserve it by hiding it? Unless you knew something was coming. Unless you understood that catastrophe was approaching. Unless you wanted to make sure that when the disaster passed, when the survivors returned, when people came back to this place, the temple would still be here, protected, waiting, ready to teach those who came after about what had been before. The dating of Göbekli Tepe is crucial. 11,600 years ago, right before the Younger Dryas ended, right before the rapid warming, right before the massive ice melt, right before sea levels rose 400 feet, right before the world transformed. The people who built Göbekli Tepe might have seen it coming. They might have understood from observing the sky that something was wrong, that the climate was changing, that danger was approaching. So they preserved what they could. They buried their most sacred site to protect it. They marked its location, and they hoped that whoever survived would find it again and remember. Some of the pillars at Göbekli Tepe contain carvings that researchers interpret as astronomical. Star maps, comet trajectories, celestial events marked in stone. One pillar shows what appears to be a comet impact, a swarm of fragments falling from the sky, animals fleeing in panic, chaos. If this interpretation is correct, then Göbekli Tepe is not just a temple. It is a warning, a record of what they saw in the sky, a message to those who would come after. This happened. This is what we witnessed. This is why we buried everything and fled. Remember, so you will recognize it if it comes again. The site was covered for 11,000 years, until modern archaeologists dug it up and realized what they had found. Not the beginning of civilization, but evidence of something that came before, something sophisticated enough to build monuments, something organized enough to bury them when catastrophe threatened, something that knew endings were coming and tried to preserve what mattered most. Travel west to Egypt, to the Nile Valley, where another great civilization emerged seemingly overnight with no clear precursors. The ancient Egyptians themselves insisted they were not the first. They described an earlier age, a time called Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods walked the earth, when the foundations were laid, when knowledge was given and temples were built and the sacred traditions were established. Then Zep Tepi ended. The texts do not explain how or why clearly. References to darkness, to enemies, to chaos, to the sacred island being destroyed. The details are fragmentary, obscure, but the pattern is clear. There was a before, there was an ending, and what came after was restoration, recovery, rebuilding on foundations laid in an earlier age. Egyptian temple texts repeatedly claim to be reconstructing buildings that stood in Zep Tepi, following plans from the first time, restoring what the ancestors built. This is not new construction. This is renovation, preservation, carrying forward traditions that predate Egyptian civilization itself. The Edfu temple texts, inscribed on walls during the Ptolemaic period, but claiming to preserve much older knowledge, describe how the first temples were built by divine beings called the Neteru. These beings brought wisdom, taught agriculture, established law, organized society. Then they departed or died, and humanity was left to maintain what had been given. The pyramid texts, some of the oldest religious writings in the world, contain passages describing pharaohs joining the gods in the afterlife. But these gods are described in past tense, as beings who once lived but no longer do, as ancestors who dwelt in Egypt during Zep Tepi and then left or died when that age ended. What if Zep Tepi was not mythology? What if it was memory? Memory of a time before the dynasties, before hieroglyphics, before the Egypt we recognize, a time when another culture existed in the Nile Valley, a culture destroyed by catastrophe, a culture whose survivors taught the people who would become the Egyptians, a culture remembered as gods simply because their knowledge seemed impossibly advanced to those who inherited it. The Egyptians built their civilization on foundations they claimed were older than themselves. They preserved astronomical knowledge that required centuries of observation. They used mathematical systems that appeared complete from the beginning. They constructed monuments aligned to celestial events with precision that demanded sophisticated understanding of geometry and astronomy. And they said, again and again in their texts, that they were not inventing this knowledge, they were maintaining it, preserving what the first time had given them, keeping alive traditions from before the ending. But Egypt and Turkey are not alone. The flood story appears everywhere, in cultures that never had contact, in languages that share no common root, in peoples separated by oceans and continents. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence, too detailed to be independent invention. These are not creation myths. These are disaster reports, memories of endings preserved by those who survived. In India, the ancient Hindu texts describe Manu, the first man, warned by a fish that a great flood is coming. A pralaya, a cosmic dissolution. Manu builds a boat, brings the 7 sages, brings seeds of all plants, brings animals. The waters rise. Everything drowns except those in the boat. The fish, revealed as the god Vishnu, pulls the boat through the churning waters for years until bringing it to rest on the highest peak of the Himalayas. Manu emerges, performs rituals, plants the seeds. Humanity begins again. The Hindu version adds cosmic cycles. The flood is part of the eternal pattern of creation and destruction. But beneath the theology, the structure is identical. Warning, boat, survivors, knowledge preserved, world rebuilt. In Greece, Zeus grows angry with humanity and sends a flood to destroy them. But Prometheus, the titan who gave fire to humans, warns his son Deucalion. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha build a chest. The rains come, everything drowns. The chest floats for 9 days until coming to rest on Mount Parnassus. Deucalion and Pyrrha emerge. They are alone. The world is empty. They throw stones over their shoulders. The stones become people. Humanity is restored. Different mechanism for rebuilding. But the same pattern. Divine anger, flood, soul survivors, empty world, restoration. In Mesoamerica, the Aztec cosmology describes 5 suns, 5 world ages. 4 have already ended. The fourth sun ended in water, a great flood called Atunatya. The gods warned one couple, Tata and Nene. They hollowed out a cypress tree, climbed inside with food. The heavens collapsed. Water rose from below. Everything drowned for 52 years. Only Tata and Nene survived. Their children repopulated the earth. The Mayan Popol Vuh describes multiple creations and destructions. The gods made humans from mud. Too soft, they dissolved in water. The gods made humans from wood. Too hard, no souls. The gods destroyed them with a flood. Finally, the gods made humans from maize. These survived. These became the Maya. Creation through destruction. Each attempt ending in catastrophe. Each new beginning built on the ruins of what failed. The pattern of endings leading to new starts. In North America, indigenous traditions across dozens of tribes preserve flood stories. The Ojibwe tell of Nanabojo surviving flood waters by clinging to a log with animals. After the waters recede, he sends animals diving to bring up mud from below. Muskrat succeeds. From that mud, Nanabojo recreates the earth. The Hopi describe multiple worlds. The first world destroyed by fire, the second by ice, the third by flood. Before each destruction, the gods warned the righteous and helped them escape to the next world. The fourth world, the current one, will also end one day. Then the fifth world will begin. The Cree, the Blackfoot, the Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Haida, the Tlingit, tribe after tribe, nation after nation, all preserving variations of the same story: water, destruction, survival, rebuilding. In Australia, Aboriginal Dreamtime stories contain detailed accounts of rising seas and drowning lands. The Gunditj Mara people of Victoria describe a time when you could walk to what are now islands. When the coastline was different, then the water rose. The land was cut off. People had to move inland. Geological studies confirm this. During the last ice age, sea level around Australia was over 400 feet lower than today. The continental shelf was exposed. People lived there, and when the ice melted, those lands were drowned. The coastline moved inland by hundreds of miles. The Aboriginal stories preserve this memory. Stories passed down orally for 10,000 years or more. Stories that match the geological record with surprising accuracy. This is not myth. This is oral history. Memory of real events preserved in the only format available to a culture without writing. The geographical distribution is total. Every inhabited continent, every major civilization, every climate zone, from tropical islands to Arctic tundra, from river valleys to mountain highlands. Everywhere humans lived, they preserve stories of the Great Flood, the catastrophe, the ending, the survival. The standard explanation is independent invention. Flooding is common. Every culture experiences it. So every culture creates flood mythology. But that explanation fails to account for the details. These stories do not just describe local floods. They describe world-ending catastrophes, water covering mountains, everyone drowning except a chosen few, complete destruction followed by complete rebuilding. Local floods do not destroy the entire world. They destroy villages, regions. But people in the next valley, people in the mountains, people on the coast, they are fine. Life continues. The world does not end. Yet the stories consistently describe total destruction, universal catastrophe. As if the people telling these stories believed their entire world had ended. Not just been damaged, ended. This makes sense if the stories preserve memory of the Ice Age flooding, when sea levels rose 400 feet over several thousand years, when coastlines where people lived were submerged beneath hundreds of feet of water, when river valleys were drowned, when entire landscapes were transformed. For people living through that transformation, it was the end of the world. Gradual, yes, spanning generations, but relentless. The water kept rising, communities kept moving inland, settlements kept being abandoned, knowledge kept being lost as people scattered and populations fragmented. Those who survived carried stories. Stories about the time before, when you could walk where there is now ocean, when cities existed that are now drowned, when knowledge was more complete before so much was lost. Stories passed down through oral tradition for thousands of years until writing finally captured them. By then, the details had shifted. The timescale had compressed. Thousands of years of gradual flooding became 40 days and nights of rain. Regional inundations became global deluges. But the core remained: water, loss, survival, rebuilding, the memory of ending, and the hope of beginning again. The stories are not myths, they are testimony. Witness accounts filtered through countless generations but still grounded in reality. The reality of catastrophe. The reality that civilizations do not last forever. The reality that the world can end, has ended, will end again, and all of them, every single one of these stories from every culture, contain the same message, the same warning pressed into clay by Mesopotamian scribes, preserved in Egyptian temple texts, buried beneath Turkish hilltops, sung in Aboriginal songlines, carved on Mayan pyramids. This has happened before. Water came, worlds ended, knowledge was lost, survivors rebuilt from fragments. And if we do not remember, if we do not preserve, if we do not pass forward what matters, it will happen again. The ending will come, and those who survive will have to start over with even less than we have now. The global witnesses are not separate stories. They are the same story told from different angles. The story of humanity facing catastrophe, surviving, rebuilding, and trying desperately to make sure the next generation remembers what was lost and why it must not be lost again. The tablets were right. We are not the first. We are not even the second. We are the inheritors of a long line of civilizations that rose and fell and rose again. And the only reason we know anything at all is because someone, somewhere, every time, chose to preserve the memory, chose to write it down, chose to pass it forward. The witnesses are still speaking. From clay tablets in Iraq, from temple walls in Egypt, from buried stones in Turkey, from oral traditions in Australia, from codices in Mexico, all of them saying the same thing across time and distance and culture. Remember the ending. Remember what was lost. Remember that it can happen again. And choose, now, while there is still time, what you will save, what you will preserve, what you will pass forward to those who come after. Because the water always comes, the catastrophe always arrives, and the only thing that survives is what we choose to remember. Knowledge does not appear from nothing. It is not born fully formed. It is built, slowly, painfully, through generations of failure and adjustment, through the accumulated experience of countless people trying, failing, learning, trying again. A farmer does not wake up knowing crop rotation. A metal worker does not instinctively understand alloy ratios. A scribe does not spontaneously invent a writing system with 700 symbols. An astronomer does not accidentally discover eclipse cycles spanning decades. Knowledge requires time. It requires teachers. It requires an unbroken chain of transmission from those who know to those who learn. And when that chain breaks, when catastrophe interrupts the transmission, knowledge dies. Skills are lost. Understanding vanishes. And the survivors must begin again from nearly nothing. Unless someone, somewhere, makes the choice to preserve it, to write it down before the ending comes, to press the most important knowledge into clay, or carve it into stone, or encode it in stories that will survive when everything else is destroyed. This is what the tablets contain. Not the knowledge of people inventing civilization from scratch, the knowledge of people desperately trying to save what they could before it was lost. Emergency protocols, survival information, the condensed wisdom of a world that was ending, compressed and preserved by those who understood that time was running out. Let us begin with the mathematics. The Sumerian base 60 system. We still use it today without thinking. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. We divide time and angles using mathematics invented over 5,000 years ago. Mathematics that appeared complete from the beginning with no developmental stages. Why 60? Because 60 is mathematically perfect for a culture that needs to divide things evenly. 60 has more divisors than any smaller number. You can split it cleanly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. This makes trade easier, construction simpler, calculations faster. Someone understood this. Someone chose 60 deliberately because of its mathematical properties. But choosing a number system is not the same as implementing it. To actually use base 60 requires teaching an entire population to think differently, to count differently, to calculate differently. This takes time, generations. You cannot simply announce a new number system and expect everyone to adopt it overnight. Yet Sumerian mathematics appears already established, already in use, already embedded in every aspect of their civilization from the earliest records. As if the system was not being introduced but maintained, preserved from a time when it had already been fully developed and tested and proven to work. The mathematical tablets show advanced calculations, square roots, cube roots, geometric progressions, compound interest, problems involving irregular areas and volumes. The Yale tablet showing the square root of 2 calculated to 6 decimal places. This is not basic arithmetic. This is sophisticated mathematics that requires understanding irrational numbers. Concepts that supposedly were not formalized until the Greeks 2,000 years later. Where did the Sumerians learn this? Who taught them? Or more accurately, who taught the people who taught them? Who preserved this mathematical knowledge across the catastrophe? Who made sure that after the flood, after the destruction, after the world ended, someone would still know how to calculate and measure and build? Move to astronomy. The tablets contain observations of Venus spanning decades, tracking when it appears in the morning sky, when it vanishes, when it reappears in the evening. The cycles are complex. The patterns take years to recognize. To create accurate records requires watching every night, recording every observation, comparing data across generations. This is institutional astronomy. Multiple observers working together over long periods, all following the same methods, all contributing to collective knowledge. This kind of observational program requires resources, organization, commitment, and most importantly, it requires continuity. An unbroken chain of astronomers passing their knowledge and methods to the next generation. The Sumerians had this from the beginning. Their earliest astronomical texts show the same level of sophistication as later ones. No learning period, no corrections being made, just accurate observations recorded by people who clearly knew exactly what they were doing. They tracked lunar eclipses, recognized the Saros cycle, the 18-year period when patterns repeat. Knowing this allows prediction. The moon will be eclipsed on this date. This knowledge is tremendously valuable for a culture that sees eclipses as omens requiring interpretation. But recognizing the Saros cycle requires observing multiple cycles. 3 or 4 complete repetitions to be certain. That is 70 years of continuous sky watching, 3 generations, an entire human lifetime dedicated to watching, recording, preserving. How do you establish that kind of program unless someone teaches you it is important? Unless someone shows you what to look for? Unless someone passes down observational knowledge that predates your civilization? The tablets describe exactly this. They describe teachers, divine figures called the Anunnaki, who descended from elsewhere and taught humanity how to observe the heavens, how to track the movements of celestial bodies, how to recognize patterns, how to predict events. Not vague inspiration, specific instruction, direct knowledge transmission from those who knew to those who did not. We dismiss this as mythology because we assume the Anunnaki were supernatural beings, gods, imaginary figures invented to explain natural phenomena. But what if the tablets meant exactly what they said? Not that gods came from heaven, but that teachers came from elsewhere. survivors of the pre-flood world carrying astronomical knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate. Knowledge that would be lost if they did not pass it on. They taught, the Sumerians learned, and they wrote it all down because they understood how fragile knowledge is, how easily it can be lost, how catastrophe can erase centuries of accumulated understanding in a single generation. The medical knowledge tells the same story. The tablets contain prescriptions using plants with genuine medicinal properties: thyme for infections, willow bark for pain, fermented grains for digestion, honey for wounds. Modern pharmacology confirms these treatments work. The active compounds are real, the applications are appropriate, but discovering which plants help and which harm requires extensive testing, generations of healers trying different remedies, observing results, refining techniques. This knowledge cannot be guessed. It must be learned through experience. And experience requires time. Yet Sumerian medicine appears effective immediately. The earliest medical tablets show functional treatments, no record of failed experiments, no evidence of learning through mistakes, just working pharmacology from the start. As if the knowledge was not being discovered, but remembered, preserved from a time when it had already been tested and proven. The same pattern appears in metallurgy. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. The optimal ratio is roughly 88% copper and 12% tin. Too much tin makes the metal brittle. Too little makes it soft. Getting the ratio right is the difference between tools that work and expensive failures. Sumerian bronze consistently hits the correct proportions. From the earliest examples, no bronze artifacts showing wrong ratios, no evidence of experimental batches that failed, just proper bronze from the beginning, as if someone had already figured out the formula and was teaching it to others rather than discovering it through trial and error. Creating bronze also requires high temperatures. Over 1,000 degrees, controlled firing, proper furnace design, bellows to force air and raise heat. These are not intuitive skills, they must be learned. Usually through building furnaces that collapse and batches that fail and decades of refinement. But Sumerian metallurgy shows professional quality from early stages. Well-made tools, effective weapons, decorative objects with fine detail, all produced by people who clearly knew their craft, who had been taught by someone, who were preserving techniques passed down from teachers who understood metal and fire and transformation. The architectural knowledge is equally sophisticated. The ziggurats are massive, engineered structures, millions of bricks, foundations designed to support enormous weight on soft soil, walls angled to distribute load properly, drainage systems to prevent water damage, alignment to cardinal directions requiring precise surveying. This level of engineering does not happen by accident. It requires understanding physics, understanding soil mechanics, understanding geometry, knowledge that normally comes from experience, from building smaller structures first, from learning what works through failures. But the Sumerian ziggurats show competence from early attempts. The foundations are solid, the structures stand for thousands of years, the engineering works. No collapsed proto-ziggurats, showing them learning through mistakes. Just skill that had to have come from somewhere. From teachers who already understood how to build monuments that would last. The legal knowledge is perhaps most revealing. The earliest Sumerian law codes are comprehensive. They distinguish between intentional and accidental harm. They recognize different social classes with different obligations. They include property rights, contracts, inheritance, marriage, divorce, commerce. They specify proportional punishments. They include appeals, processes. This is sophisticated jurisprudence, the kind that usually evolves over centuries as societies encounter problems and develop solutions. New situations arise. Existing laws prove inadequate. Adjustments are made. Gaps are filled. The legal system grows organically through accumulated case law, but Sumerian law appears complete from the beginning. as if the entire framework was designed at once by people who already understood the full spectrum of human conflict, who had already thought through the complications, who were not inventing a legal system but restoring one that had existed before. And woven through all of this knowledge, through every domain, through mathematics and astronomy and medicine and metallurgy and architecture and law, is that recurring phrase, that statement appearing again and again in different contexts. Knowledge was given, not discovered, not invented through patient experimentation. Given, taught, transmitted by those who knew to those who did not, from distant days. As if the knowledge came from before, from a time that predated the Sumerian civilization itself, from the world that existed before the flood swept over and kingship had to be lowered from heaven again. The tablets describe teachers, the Anunnaki, divine figures who descended and organized civilization, who taught humanity how to write and calculate and build and heal and judge, who established the systems, who showed people what to preserve, who made sure that knowledge would survive the catastrophe. We read this as mythology because we cannot imagine it being anything else. Gods teaching humans, divine intervention, supernatural explanation for natural achievements. But strip away the theological language and what remains? Teachers, knowledge transmission, organized effort to preserve important information. People who knew instructing people who did not know. What if the Anunnaki were not gods but survivors? Refugees from the pre-flood world carrying fragments of a more advanced civilization. People whose knowledge seemed godlike simply because it was so far beyond what the post-flood survivors possessed. Teachers who were elevated to divine status over generations as memory faded and facts became legends. The tablets say knowledge was given. They say teachers came from elsewhere. They say civilization was restored rather than invented. Maybe they meant it literally, not supernatural intervention, but human knowledge transmission. The desperate effort of survivors to pass forward what they could before it was lost completely. This explains why Sumerian knowledge appears complete. It was not being developed from scratch. It was being reconstructed from memory, from fragments, from whatever the survivors could remember and teach and write down before they died, and their memories died with them. The tablets were not textbooks for inventing civilization. They were emergency manuals for rebuilding it. Condensed knowledge, compressed wisdom, the most important information preserved in the most permanent format available. Clay that would not burn, clay that would not rot, clay that would survive fire and flood and collapse and 5,000 years of burial. The scribes were not recording new discoveries. They were preserving old knowledge. Knowledge from before, knowledge from the world that ended. Knowledge that had to be written down immediately before the last people who remembered were gone and the information was lost forever. This is why the tablets read with such urgency. Why they contain so much practical detail. Why they explain not just what to do but how to do it. Why they include measurements and ratios and specific instructions. Because they were not written for scholars. They were written for survivors. For people who would need to rebuild. For people who would need every scrap of knowledge they could get. The tablets are not history lessons. They are survival guides, emergency protocols. The condensed wisdom of a dying world pressed into clay by hands that understood time was running out. By people who had witnessed the ending and wanted to make sure that those who came after would have something to build with, some foundation to stand on. Some knowledge to start from, rather than having to rediscover everything the hard way. That is what makes the Sumerian knowledge so remarkable. Not that it appeared fully formed, but that it survived at all. That, after catastrophe destroyed the world that created it, after the teachers died and the cities drowned and continuity shattered, someone managed to preserve enough, to pass forward enough. To write down enough that civilization could rebuild without starting from absolute zero. The tablets are that preserved knowledge. Emergency transmissions from the ending. Final messages from people who knew their world was dying and wanted to save what they could. Mathematics, so the survivors could calculate and build. Astronomy so they could navigate and plant crops at the right times. Medicine so they could heal. Metallurgy so they could make tools. Architecture so they could construct shelter. Law so they could organize society. Everything necessary to rebuild. Everything essential to survive. Compressed, preserved, passed forward through the one medium that could survive anything. Clay pressed with words by urgent hands. Clay fired hard by catastrophe itself. Clay buried beneath the ruins, waiting for someone to dig it up and read it and understand. This is not the beginning of knowledge. This is what survived the ending. The fragments salvaged from the wreckage. The scraps carried forward by refugees. The desperate preservation effort of people who understood that knowledge dies when people die unless someone writes it down, unless someone makes it permanent, unless someone chooses to save it. They chose, they wrote, they preserved, and the knowledge survived, not complete, not intact, but enough. Enough to rebuild, enough to continue. Enough to give the next civilization a foundation to stand on rather than forcing them to rediscover fire and the wheel and writing and mathematics all over again from nothing. The tablets are proof that knowledge can survive catastrophe. If someone chooses to preserve it, if someone takes the time to write it down, if someone understands that memory is fragile and civilization is temporary, and the only thing standing between humanity and starting over from zero is the choice to save what matters. They made that choice 5,000 years ago. In the aftermath of catastrophe, in the ruins of the world that was, they looked at what little they had left, and they wrote it down. Everything, mathematics and astronomy and medicine and more. All of it pressed into clay, all of it preserved, all of it passed forward to us. This is not the knowledge of beginners. This is the knowledge of survivors. People who understood endings, who had lived through one, who knew that everything could be lost, and who chose, before it was too late, to make sure something would remain. The tablets are that something, the knowledge that survived, the wisdom pressed into clay by hands that knew the world was ending, the gift from those who came before to those who would come after, the promise that even after catastrophe, even after the flood, even after everything ends, knowledge can survive. If we choose to save it, if we choose to remember, if we choose to pass it forward, the wind still moves across the desert, patient, eternal, carrying dust that was once walls, dust that was once temples, dust that was once the hands that pressed words into clay 5,000 years ago. The wind does not care about time. It does not care about empires that rise and fall. It does not care about knowledge gained and lost and gained again. It simply moves, turning everything back to sand, erasing everything, eventually. Everything except the questions. The questions remain, pressed into clay, buried beneath the ruins, waiting in the darkness, waiting for hands to dig them up, waiting for eyes to read them, waiting for minds to understand what they were really saying. And what were they saying? What message did those ancient scribes press into wet clay with such urgency? What warning did they fire hard in flames? What testimony did they bury in archives, hoping someone, someday, would find? This is not the beginning. This is the ending. This is what we saw. This is what was lost. This is what we tried to save. Remember us. Remember what happened. Remember that it can happen again. They were not celebrating dawn. They were documenting dusk, the long twilight after the sun had already set on something greater, something older, something now drowned beneath 8 feet of mud in the bottom of Leonard Woolley's trench. The tablets are not creation stories. They are casualty reports. Records of what existed before the catastrophe. Lists of what was lost. Instructions for rebuilding from fragments. Emergency protocols pressed into clay by people who knew their world was ending and wanted to make sure something would survive. They succeeded. The tablets survived. Fire made them harder. Water could not wash the words away. Collapsing buildings buried them but did not destroy them. 5,000 years of wind and war and forgetting passed over them. And still they waited. Still they held the words. Still, they carried the message forward. We are not the first. We are not the beginning. We are the aftermath, the inheritors, the ones who came after. And everything we think we invented, everything we believe we discovered, everything we assume makes us special was known before, was lost, was laboriously, desperately, incompletely preserved by survivors who understood what was slipping away. Sit with that for a moment. Really sit with it. Everything we are proud of, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, law, writing itself, none of it original, none of it new, all of it recovered, rebuilt, restored from fragments of memory by people who watched a more advanced world die and tried to save what they could before the knowledge disappeared forever. We are not pioneers, we are archaeologists, digging through the ruins of our own past, finding pieces, recognizing patterns, slowly, painfully, reconstructing what was already known before catastrophe interrupted the transmission. How many times has this happened? How many cycles of rise and fall and rise again? How many civilizations have built and flourished and accumulated knowledge only to have it all erased by flood or fire or impact or war or collapse? How many times have survivors been forced to start over with nothing but fragments and the desperate hope that this time, they will write it down, this time they will preserve it, this time the chain will not break? The tablets suggest this has happened before, many times before. The Sumerian king list divides history at the flood, but it describes kingship descending from heaven. Again, not for the first time, again. As if this restoration had happened before, as if the cycle was already old when the Sumerians wrote it down. The Egyptian texts describe Zep-Tepi, the first time, but also earlier times, previous ages, worlds that came before, foundations laid by those who are now gone, knowledge passed down from ancestors whose names are forgotten but whose wisdom remains. The Hindu texts speak of cosmic cycles, yugas, ages, each one ending in dissolution, pralaya, catastrophe, then rebirth, then the same pattern repeating, over and over, creation, preservation, destruction, creation, preservation, destruction. An eternal cycle with no beginning and no end, just the constant rhythm of civilizations rising and falling and rising again. The Hopi speak of multiple worlds, the first destroyed by fire, the second by ice, the third by flood, the fourth, our current world, will also end. Then the fifth world will begin, and presumably it too will end one day, and a sixth will follow, the pattern continuing. These are not isolated myths, they are global testimony. Every culture that survived long enough to develop writing recorded the same message. This has happened before. The world ended, we rebuilt, and it will happen again. Maybe they were right. Maybe we are not living in the first human civilization. Maybe we are living in the 5th or the 10th or the 100th. Maybe every time we think we are inventing something new, we are actually remembering something old, rediscovering what was known before, rebuilding what was destroyed in the last catastrophe. And maybe that is why the knowledge appears so suddenly in places like Sumer. Not because gods taught them, not because they were uniquely brilliant, but because they were the inheritors, the students of survivors, the ones who received fragments of knowledge from people who came from the world before, people who carried what they could remember, people who taught what they could preserve, people who died knowing they had passed something forward even if it was incomplete. The tablets are proof of this inheritance. Mathematical systems appearing complete, astronomical knowledge requiring generations of observation, medical treatments that actually work, architectural sophistication, legal complexity, all of it present from the beginning because it was not being invented, it was being restored. And if that is true, then the real question is not where did human civilization begin? The real question is how much have we forgotten? How much was lost in the last catastrophe? How much knowledge existed in the world before the flood that did not make it into the tablets? That did not survive the 8 feet of mud? that died with the last people who remembered? We will never know. The coastlines where people would have lived are now underwater. The river valleys where cities stood are buried beneath millennia of silt. The knowledge that was not written down is simply gone, erased, as if it never existed. All we have are fragments, clay tablets scattered across Iraq, temple inscriptions in Egypt, buried stones in Turkey, oral traditions in Australia, myths in Greece and India and Mexico, pieces of a puzzle that will never be complete, echoes of voices that will never be fully heard, shadows of a world that drowned 5,000 years ago, or 10,000 or longer. But the fragments tell us enough. Enough to know that we are not the first, enough to understand that civilizations end, enough to recognize that knowledge is fragile, and enough to realize that the only thing standing between humanity and starting over from zero is the choice to write it down, to preserve it, to pass it forward. The Sumerians made that choice. In the aftermath of catastrophe, in the ruins of the world before, they looked at what little knowledge remained, and they wrote it all down. Everything they could remember, everything the survivors had taught them, everything that seemed important enough to preserve. They pressed it into clay. They fired it hard. They stored it in archives. They copied it when tablets wore out. They taught it to students who would copy it again. They did everything they could to make sure the chain would not break, that the knowledge would not die, that something would survive the next catastrophe when it came, because they knew it would come. They had lived through one ending already. They understood that catastrophe is not exceptional. It is inevitable. Water rises, comets fall, climate changes, civilizations collapse. The question is not whether it will happen. The question is, what will survive when it does? And that question falls to us now. We are living in the calm between catastrophes, in the rebuild after the last ending, in the time before the next one begins. And we face the same choice the Sumerian scribes faced 5,000 years ago. What will we preserve? What will we write down? What do we believe is important enough to pass forward? What knowledge do we consider essential for those who will come after us when our world ends and they have to rebuild from fragments? Because our world will end, not today, not tomorrow, maybe not in our lifetimes, but it will end. Catastrophe always comes. Climate shifts, resources deplete, systems fail, societies collapse, water rises, or fire falls, or plague spreads, or war consumes, or simply the slow entropy of complexity eating itself until nothing remains but ruins. History is not linear progress. History is cyclical catastrophe. Civilizations rise, they flourish, they accumulate knowledge. Then something breaks. Flood, or drought, or invasion, or internal collapse. The cities empty. The knowledge dies. The survivors scatter, and the long work of rebuilding begins again from whatever fragments can be salvaged. We are in one of those rebuilding phases now. We have been for thousands of years, slowly recovering what was lost, slowly piecing together the puzzle, slowly climbing back toward the level of knowledge that existed before the last catastrophe erased it. The tablets prove this. They show us that sophisticated knowledge existed 5,000 years ago. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, engineering. Not primitive fumbling toward understanding. Sophisticated knowledge that required centuries to develop. Knowledge that could only have come from a long period of stable civilization. Knowledge that was interrupted by catastrophe and had to be preserved by desperate scribes who understood they were writing the final testimony of their world. And if it happened then, it will happen again. The pattern repeats. Rise, flourish, catastrophe, collapse. Rise, flourish, catastrophe, collapse. Over and over. The only variable is what survives, what gets preserved, what makes it across the gap between the world that ends and the world that begins after. The Sumerians preserved what they could. They chose writing and mathematics and astronomy and medicine and law. the essential tools for rebuilding civilization. The knowledge that would allow survivors to organize, to build, to heal, to calculate, to navigate. They compressed it. They simplified it. They made it as accessible as possible, and they pressed it into clay that would not burn and would not rot and would last until someone found it. We need to make the same choice. Now, while there is still time, before the next catastrophe comes, before the systems fail, before the knowledge is lost again, we need to decide what matters, what is essential, what absolutely must survive, even if everything else is destroyed. And then we need to preserve it. Not in digital formats that require electricity and infrastructure, not in books that can burn or rot or be destroyed, but in something permanent, something that will last, something that survivors can find and read and use to rebuild. The Sumerians chose clay. What will we choose? What medium will carry our knowledge across the catastrophe? What message will we press into that medium? What warning will we give to those who come after? Because they are coming. The people who will rebuild after we are gone. The people who will dig through our ruins the way we dug through Sumerian ruins. The people who will find whatever we left behind and try to understand what happened, what we knew, what we lost, why we failed to preserve it. They will judge us, not by our technology, not by our wealth, not by our power, but by what we chose to save, by what knowledge we considered important enough to preserve, by whether we learned the lesson the tablets have been trying to teach us for 5,000 years. Memory is all that survives catastrophe. Not buildings, not borders, not gold or monuments or empires, just memory, knowledge, the things written down, the things preserved, the things passed forward from those who knew to those who will need to know. The Sumerian scribes understood this. They lived in the aftermath. They knew what had been lost. They knew how easily everything can disappear. So they wrote, urgently, completely, pressing every scrap of knowledge they possessed into clay, creating a library of survival, a guide for rebuilding, a message to whoever would come after. That message has reached us 5,000 years later. Across catastrophe and time and the death of languages and empires, the clay survived, the words survived, and now we hold them, we read them, we understand them. Finally, after centuries of the tablets sitting silent in museums, after decades of translation, we finally hear what they were trying to tell us. We are not the first. We are not the beginning. We are the inheritors of a knowledge chain stretching back farther than we know. Back through catastrophes we do not remember. Back through civilizations whose names are lost. Back through endings and rebuildings and endings again. An unbroken line of humans choosing to preserve, choosing to remember, choosing to pass forward what matters. And now that line reaches us. The tablets are in our hands. The knowledge is in our minds. The responsibility is on our shoulders. What will we do with it? Will we preserve it? Will we add to it? Will we pass it forward? Or will we let the chain break? Will we lose it again? Will we force the next generation to start over from zero with nothing but fragments and myths and the faint hope that maybe someone before them knew something worth remembering? The choice is ours, just as it was the Sumerians' choice, just as it has been every generation's choice when they lived in the calm between catastrophes, the time when it seems like things will last forever, when it seems like knowledge is safe, when it seems like we have all the time in the world to preserve and pass forward. We do not have all the time in the world. We never have. Time runs out. Catastrophe comes. The world ends. And the only thing that survives is what we choose to save. So choose. Now. While you still can. Look at what you know. Look at what you have learned. Look at what you believe matters. And ask yourself, if the world ended tomorrow, what would you want to survive? What knowledge is so important, so essential, so valuable that it must make it across the catastrophe to those who come after? And then preserve it. Write it down. Make it permanent. Make it accessible. Make it clear enough that someone digging through ruins 5,000 years from now will be able to find it and read it and understand it and use it to rebuild. This is not dramatic. This is not paranoid. This is practical. This is what every wise civilization does when it understands that endings come. The Sumerians did it. The Egyptians did it. The people who built Göbekli Tepe did it. They all made the same choice: to preserve, to remember, to pass forward. And because they made that choice, we have something to build on. We have knowledge. We have mathematics and astronomy and medicine and writing. We have more than zero, but we could have had more. We could have had everything. If the catastrophe had not come, if the knowledge had not been lost, if the chain had not been broken, we could be standing on the shoulders of a civilization far more advanced than ours. We could be inheriting knowledge accumulated over tens of thousands of years of uninterrupted development. Instead, we have fragments. We have whatever survived the last ending. We have the desperate preservation efforts of scribes who knew time was running out. We have enough to rebuild, but not enough to avoid rebuilding. Not enough to skip the long, painful process of rediscovery. Not enough to avoid repeating the mistakes that led to collapse in the first place. Maybe the next generation will inherit more, if we choose, if we preserve, if we write it down, if we make sure that when the catastrophe comes, when our world ends, when survivors dig through our ruins, they will find something: a library, a guide, a message from us to them saying, "This is what we knew. This is what mattered. This is what we chose to save. Learn from it. Build on it. Do not let it be lost again." That is the message in the tablets. That is what the Sumerian scribes pressed into clay 5,000 years ago. That is what they fired hard and buried deep and preserved through catastrophe. Not instructions for inventing civilization. Instructions for rebuilding it. A gift from the ending to the beginning that comes after. And now we hold that gift. We read those instructions. We understand that message. And we face the same responsibility they faced. To be the link in the chain. To preserve what we have. To add what we can. To pass it all forward. To make sure that when our ending comes, something survives. Something remains. Something continues. Because that is what makes us human. Not our tools, not our cities, not our technology, but our memory, our ability to learn from those who came before, our choice to teach those who come after, our determination to preserve knowledge across the catastrophes that would otherwise erase everything. The tablets are proof that this is possible. That knowledge can survive endings. That memory can cross the gap between worlds. That the chain can hold even when everything else breaks. If someone chooses to write it down, if someone chooses to preserve it, if someone chooses to pass it forward. The Sumerians made that choice. In the ruins, in the aftermath, with urgent hands and clay that would not burn, they wrote for us, they preserved for us, they gifted us the knowledge that allows us to be here now, reading their words, understanding their warning, facing our own choice. What will we choose? Will we continue the chain? Will we preserve and pass forward? Will we write our knowledge in a form that will survive our ending? Or will we assume we have time? Will we assume catastrophe will not come? Will we assume the next generation will be fine without our help? The Sumerians did not assume. They knew. They had watched their world drown. They had lived through the ending. They understood that nothing is permanent, that civilizations fall, that knowledge dies. That memory fades, unless someone writes it down, unless someone makes it permanent, unless someone chooses to save it. They chose, they wrote, they saved. And 5,000 years later, their words still speak, still teach, still warn, still remind us of what we are forgetting in our comfortable moment between catastrophes. That endings come, that civilizations are temporary, that knowledge is fragile, and that the only defense is memory, preservation, the deliberate, determined choice to write it down before it is too late. If you have found meaning in this journey through time, if these questions have resonated, If you have felt the weight of 5,000 years pressing forward through clay and sand and silence, then take a moment, like this video, subscribe to this channel. Your support keeps these stories alive, keeps the memory chain unbroken, keeps the conversation going about what we are and where we came from and what we owe to those who come after. And perhaps that is the ultimate message hidden in those ancient tablets. Not just what happened, but that someone cared enough to write it down, to preserve it, to send it forward through time to us. That alone is remarkable. That alone matters. That alone is worth honoring. We do the same now, in our own way, recording, sharing, remembering, questioning, refusing to let the past be erased, refusing to accept easy answers when the evidence suggests something deeper, refusing to assume we know everything when the tablets whisper that we have forgotten almost everything. Thank you for listening. Thank you for wondering. Thank you for caring about questions that have no simple answers. Thank you for being part of the memory chain, part of the long, unbroken line of humans who choose to remember, who choose to preserve, who choose to pass forward. The past is not dead. It lives in these fragments, in these words, in these questions, and in you, in your choice to listen, your choice to wonder, your choice to remember. Until the next mystery calls us back into the ruins, may you carry this awareness that we are not alone in time, that others came before, that they faced endings and survived, that they preserved what they could and passed it forward, that we are the recipients of their gift, the inheritors of their warning, the continuation of their hope. May you rest peacefully tonight knowing the story continues, that the chain holds, that memory survives, and that somewhere in the darkness, clay tablets still wait with messages we have not yet read, words we have not yet understood, warnings we have not yet heeded. The wind passes over the desert one last time tonight. The sand settles, the stars emerge, and somewhere beneath it all, beneath the ruins and the silence and the weight of centuries, clay fragments wait. They have been waiting for 5,000 years. They can wait longer, patient as stone, silent as dust, holding words pressed by hands that knew the world was ending, hands that chose to write anyway, hands that believed someone, someday, would find them and read them and understand. We are those someones. We found them, we read them. Now we must choose whether we understand, whether we heed the warning, whether we preserve what we know before our own ending comes, whether we write in clay or stone or some other medium that will last, whether we pass forward what matters. The tablets are not myths, they are not ancient history, they are a mirror reflecting our own future back to us, showing us what happens when civilizations end, reminding us that we are not the first, warning us that we will not be the last, asking us, urgently, desperately, across 5,000 years of silence, what will you save? What will you preserve? What will you pass forward? And memory, patient as clay, waits for our answer, waits to see if we learned the lesson, waits to see if the chain will hold, waits to see if we choose as the Sumerians chose, to write it down, to make it permanent, to ensure that when our world ends, something survives, something remains, something continues. The memory that we were here, that we knew things, that we cared enough to preserve them, that we understood, finally, what the tablets have been trying to tell us all along. This is not the beginning, this is the ending. And what comes next depends on what we choose to save. Good night.